Hello and welcome. I am Scarpaluck, and this is City of Heroes. We're with Liberty Lass, our level 44 brute. Only needs 473,000 XP to get to level 45. We're only a bead and three quarters away, and that's because I have had to work Tina McIntyre pretty relentlessly just to get us to the little notch here, I guess. I was below this notch before. Finally, she's offering me a story arc. I still haven't done Madeline Casey's because Madeline is wanting me to hunt the Carnival, which I think I can now clear. But she's not offering me a story arc yet and won't. So because I was unable to do her, I was working Tina McIntyre. I'd actually rather do Madeline Casey's story because more of it happens indoors. A lot of these are outdoor missions in other dimensions. But the antimatter collision, here we go. So we're going to start that story arc, and then we're going to call up Madeline, and we're going to auto-complete. And that gave us a clue, and we return to her. And we're not on a story arc for her, so we won't worry about her, and we will continue with Tina McIntyre. So, this is probably going to be Portal Corp, right? Because all of her stuff is Portal Corp. No? Oh, no, I guess not. It's over here. So there are raiders. A raid leader and its crew. Not sure who we're going to be fighting here. I don't remember. Obviously didn't read it that carefully, or at all. It's been a while, guys. I mean, I think most of this level I have not recorded because I've been trying to get a story arc. I didn't feel like it was necessary to record just me doing generic missions, a bunch of outdoor missions with defeat all, where I'm just, going through trying to defeat enemies. Oh, you know what? All right, we'll do this mission, but then I want to set on +3, and we'll see how we do. Um, so who are we fighting here? Antimatter. Oh, we're fighting the. Yeah, we're fighting the guys from Pretoria. So as we go, what I'd like to do is talk about pre-written adventures. The guys on Roll for Combat had a live stream where they talked. It was Steve Blicker and Mark Seipter, who are the ones who are on Roll for Combat, and they were talking with Derek Melenda, I believe his name is, who is from the Knights of the Last Call, which is an actual play channel. Plus, he also does long form rants, kind of like what I do about various different games. And but he's not playing video games while he's doing it. He's just ranting about TTRPGs in front of the camera with a live chat going, I guess. I've only watched one of his things once, and it's been a while, so I don't really remember the exact format. But in any case, the three of them were talking about a bunch of stuff, but eventually around the 50-minute mark, they get to talking about published adventures and, whether they're any good, whether people play them, and they were comparing the old adventures to the new ones. And they were talking about how there's this sort of complaint by GMs, not players, right, who are trying to run these adventures, that Derek says they're kind of like, we want two things that are irreconcilable. And I think he did a false dichotomy, and I want to sort of explain that and kind of elaborate on it. And this is something that is related to one of the topics I talked about in my um, uh, American Truck Simulator rants, because it came up while I was doing that, and I talked about it at length. And so I'm going to reference some of that, and hopefully not repeat it too much, in case anybody who's watching this also watches that, so you don't get repetition. But I want to explain everything to the majority of people who probably haven't seen that. So what Derek said, which sounds like it might be true on the surface, but I think is not true, or it may be partially true. What he said was that the GMs who run these adventures, the published adventures, often complain that the published adventures that the published adventures are too much work, right? There's so much work that I may as well not have bought it and just made up something myself, because I have to do so much work to run this adventure. On the other hand, the other complaint that you get is that they're too railroady, right? And so he said, you kind of can't have your cake and eat it too, right? Or as my grandmother would say, you can't have two paradises. That's what she used to say. Who shot me? You. Um, if you have an adventure that you don't want to do any work, then it kind of has to be a railroad because everything is laid out for you then, and then you don't have to make anything up. If it's not a railroad, then you're going to have to make stuff up because the writer doesn't know everything the player characters are going to do. Right? So they talked about how the old school. They talk about how the old school modules, like Keep on the Borderlands and stuff, were short. And they weren't really railroads, but they also didn't have everything in there, right? All they have are basically the monsters and maybe the town NPCs. And any story is going to have to be made up. You know, that like the plot and stuff, the GM's going to have to make up because they don't really provide that in a lot of the old modules. They're just providing a keyed map. And if there's going to be a story, you're going to have to make it up. Now, I would argue you're supposed to be making it up at the table with the other players. Like, having the pre-written story be super railroady is part of the problem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to make everything up. So, anyway, his argument is that you can either have a very railroady adventure that you don't have to do any work and you can just follow it page by page as the players go through it, or you can have a very flexible type of a setting adventure where some stuff is provided for you, but you're going to have to do a lot of work and provide a lot of the material yourself because it's not a railroad. So the players can kind of go anywhere and do anything, and you're going to have to provide some of that. And then he showed like a 1,000-page, $150 book that was essentially a sandbox where you didn't have to make up anything. He said, "Yeah, I mean, maybe you could do something like this, right? But who's going to buy that?" And so he's sort of arguing that players want to have their cake and eat it, or GMs want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have a campaign or an adventure module or whatever you want to call it that doesn't require them to do any work, but isn't a railroad. And you kind of can't have both. What I would say is this is a false dichotomy. It is not the case that the only way not to do any work is to have a railroad. Right? I guess in a strict sense, if you have a railroad and you just literally follow everything it says in the book and don't allow the players to deviate and just say to them, no, you guys, you can't go down this hall. They didn't key that out in this dungeon and stuff like that. Maybe it wouldn't be a lot of work. But the reason a lot of these published adventures are too much work and more work than they should be and make you ask, what am I paying for? Is that I have to do the work as a GM that they should have done. We're not talking about a railroad. We're talking about how they'll have an encounter description, but they don't provide a map. So now I have to provide the map. Well, if I've got to provide the map, and all you gave me was a stat block and the reason for having the encounter, I'm doing a lot more work. Right? I could roll on a random table and come up with a reason for the encounter and who the monster is. Right? Where's the map? The artist who does maps is supposed to provide that for me, but it doesn't, right? Not in every single, in the big adventures, a lot of them, they don't have maps. And even if they do, if you read these like book adventures, they come out as a hardcover book. They're not a box set in most cases. There are a few, but like I don't think Curse of Strahd, unless you bought some bonus thing, it doesn't come out as a box set. It's just a book. There are maps in the books. But the maps aren't player-facing maps; they're GM-facing maps. They're all keyed out for the GM with all the landmarks and stuff already labeled, which the players aren't supposed to know until they explore. There's no fog, no fog of war, no ability for any of that. So you have this labeled map that's covering the top 1/3 of a page that shows the GM the layout. But if I'm going to create a battle on this map, I'm going to have to hand draw it myself. Where's my handout of the 11 by 17 laminated thing with hexagons or squares on it that matches the picture in the book that I can show my players? No, I got to draw that by hand. Well, now I'm doing that work, right? And In a lot of cases, they don't provide everything that you need, and you're going to have to provide it yourself anyway. It's not that it's a railroad or not. It's did they provide you all the resources? But even that isn't the biggest issue. Go ahead and provide all the resources. Give me a 1,000-page book. Doesn't matter because these things are so badly organized that they're not runnable, right? They're like, I mean, literally, even though it's not really a word, they're unrunnable as written. They cannot be run as written. Not because they can't be run like the story can't be run as it is described, but you can't use the book as it's written and just open the book in front of you and after reading through it once, just play it. You're going to have to go through and either on paper or in a computer file make a bulleted outline of every encounter and what the motivations of the villains are and stuff like that, because that information is buried in pages of text that are written like a short story. And I can't at the table pull that out of the long giant wall of text that you've given me. I need a bulleted list. And they don't provide stuff like that. So it's impossible to look it up. Luke Hart has talked about this. That he said they don't have, like, I'm working on the horror at Headstone Hill. There are over 200 NPCs that they're not all named. Some of them are just, there's 4 guys, and they're just NPCs who are like gang members or whatever. They don't name them. There's just like 5 patrons in the bar. I name the patrons, so I don't have to do it on the fly. I don't blame them for that. But there are over 150 named NPCs scattered all throughout Uinta County, and particularly in Headstone Hill, right? And they all have motivations. They have faction memberships. They have relationships to other characters. They have probable reactions to the player characters. They have their own goals and personality traits. And all of that information is scattered throughout a 128-page book. Some of it is like they mention the person in the room, that in the building where you find them, but no real details about them, and just say, okay, this guy is in this Savage Tale. And then when you go into the Savage Tale, that's where they describe the motivations of the character. It's sprinkled all over the place. Some of the characters can appear in more than one building. And there are 60 named and numbered buildings in Headstone Hill, just in the hill, never mind the other towns in Uinta County. And those buildings are alphabetically arranged, not arranged by proximity in the town. So when you have a character who's either like living in the hotel or working in the mining office, and they're right next to each other, but they have names. One name starts with an A, one name starts with a G. They're nowhere near each other in the book. So you got to flip 7 pages away to get to the motivations of the character, because the motivations are described in one room and the character is described in another room, right? They don't have like an index at the back of the book that's just a what do you want to call it, a dramatis personae, right? Where here are all the characters, their motivations, their stat blocks, and everything, all at the end of the book, because it would have been more pages, right? More expensive to print, it would be more expensive to buy. But trying to find information on characters, it's scattered throughout the book. So there's a character named Lila Denslow in Headstone Hill, and this is, I'm not picking on Savage Worlds. All adventure books are like this. And she sings a song called the Ballad of Bogwater Bill, which is supposed to lead the players to Savage Tale about Bogwater Bill. And she performs in one place, but she's living in another place. And so I can't remember which is which, but I think it's more likely you're going to encounter her in the hotel where she lives. But all the information about Lila, I think, is in the place where she performs, where she only performs once a week, right? And so it's very likely that the player characters are going to encounter her for the first time, not in the saloon where she's performing, but in the hotel where she lives, because they might be staying there too. And that the GM is going to have to try and hunt for the information on her manager and how she behaves and everything in another location from where the players are when they encounter her. It's in another part of the book, right? Very hard to find, very hard to hunt down. They don't collect all the information you need about a character in one place. They don't collect all the information about all the characters in one place. You have to flip back and forth from page to page. It's made a little bit better in the Foundry module because they hyperlink things, and you can maybe click on it and go to the other place where the character is mentioned. But it's extremely hard to find things because these books are not written like an atlas or something, or a reference book. They are written like short stories, like novels, as if you were meant to read them. And Steve Glicker actually talks about this. He's talking about the adventure paths from Paizo, and I guess they originally were publishing these as installments in magazines, and then eventually became a company that put out adventure paths and eventually Pathfinder. And he said these things not only had to be fun to run, they had to be fun to read, because, I mean, let's face it, most of the people who were reading the magazine weren't ever going to run the adventures, but they wouldn't have kept buying the magazine if the adventures weren't fun to read. And this leads me into why these adventures are the way they are and why they're virtually useless to game masters. And the reason they're virtually useless to game masters is because they're not meant to be useful to game masters. They're meant to be interesting to read. So this comes from Donald Shepis, who is the community manager and a writer for Pinnacle Games. When I was grumbling about the campaign Blood Drive, right, and how it is, like, somebody had asked what it's like, and I said, well, it's pretty awful to run, and I don't recommend it for a new GM because it's like you have to basically rewrite the whole thing. It's really hard. I said, you know, I'm using it in Foundry, and I've had to basically duplicate each chapter in the journal. The journal has each chapter labeled, right? And I've duplicated each one, and in the duplicate, so I don't mess up the original, but in the duplicate version, I have, let me mark this to remember to come back. In the duplicated version, I took all the text, and I basically turned it into bulleted lists instead of long walls of text, right? Because it's got this whole narrative flair. So why is the sheriff on the payroll of the bad guy? Well, Marshall, the reason the sheriff is on his payroll is because the sheriff has a secret that nobody knows. The sheriff is actually an outlaw from this other town, right? It's written like you're reading a story. And I said this is so useless, and it would be so much more useful to have bulleted lists that just tell me, or what are his motivations. Okay, he's a former outlaw. You know, bullet, sheriff, former outlaw. Bullet 1, former outlaw. Bullet 2, wanted in this town. Bullet 3, on the take. Bullet 4, wants to clear his name. Right? That is what I need to run the sheriff. Right? Not all of that long text that's done in this stylized way where it's like you're trying to be written like a Louis L'Amour novel or something like that. Like, I don't need that crap. I just want to be able to run the adventure. And what Donald Shepis said is, well, he said our adventures, in most companies, adventures are not meant to be run. They're meant to be read. And I said, that's absurd. People run them. They don't read them. And he said, no, you're wrong. And I mentioned this in my American Truck Simulator episode. He said, role-playing game companies, not just Pinnacle. He said the role-playing game companies have data over decades showing that the overwhelming majority of people who buy adventures never run them. Because there are too many adventures to run, right? So in the first place. So you look at Dungeons and Dragons, don't they put out they put out a book, they used to put out, for 5e, they were putting at one point out a book every 4 months, I think, so 3 books a year. And I think it was if I'm not mistaken, one source book, like Strixhaven, which was a source book that had some adventuring in it, but was a source book for running a magical college, like Harry Potter. And 2 adventures, right? So I think the typical publishing pattern was adventure, source book, adventure, something like that. So let's say they're putting out 2 published adventures a year, and the D&D adventures are actually campaigns. They take you from level 1 to level like 12 on average, some 13, some 15, some 10, but level 1 to 12, right? Something like Curse of Strahd. These things are really long. It probably takes over a year to play a given adventure, and while you're playing that adventure, 2 more were published. You can't possibly play them all, but they want you to buy them all, right? Well, if you know you're not going to play them, why would you buy them? Well, you buy them because they're fun to read. And he said the overwhelming majority of people, 80 to 90% of people who buy these adventures, never run them, and they know they never will. So what they do is they buy them and they hope to run them, but deep down they know they never will. And they basically read them like novels, and they imagine themselves and their game group, if they have one, or an imaginary game group they hope they'll get someday, right? They imagine what it would be like to play this adventure, and in order to do that, they need it to be written like a story so that they can imagine it. If it's just bulleted lists and stuff, they're not going to be able to easily imagine it, and instead, they're going to get bored, right? So he said that the numbers that the companies have, and he said this isn't just Pinnacle and it isn't just D&D, they all have similar numbers. I guess everybody in the industry, they kind of all know each other, right? They've talked and they all have similar numbers. And those numbers tell them that only 10 to 20, averaging about 15% of the people who buy their books ever actually use them in gameplay. They buy them to read them, right? The adventure books. And so he said, we have to make them fun to read. And it's more important to make them fun to read than easy to run, because 85% of our customer base isn't going to run them, but 100% are going to read them, right? And so he said, yes, those of us who write adventures, we don't like it, right? We wish that we could um, give you adventures that are easy, make it easy for you to run. But unfortunately, doing that is going to make it hard or unpleasant to read as just a book. And he said, we got to pay our bills. We have rent to pay and kids to put through college and food to put on the table and, electric bills to pay. And making a book that thousands of people read and is impossible to run or hard to run is actually better financially for us than making a book that's easy to run and hard to read, because the overwhelming majority of the audience just reads it. So this brings up what Steve Glicker said. The reason that all these adventures are now highly readable, right? He said they're as fun to read as they are to play. Well, they're a lot easier to read than they are to play, right? This is why it takes so much work to turn a published adventure into something playable at your table, right? It's not whether it's a railroad or not, it's the organization. It is not organized in a way that is easily accessible at the table. It's not organized in a way that the GM can just open it to the last page you guys were on and run it from there. He's going to have to make a lot of modifications, a lot of tweaks, a lot of changes in order to get this thing to work. Because, and we're looking for 5 devices and Dr. Calvin. Okay. Because it's written to be readable, not to be played, right? And he admitted they literally do not, like, whether this is going to actually be played, whether the battles are balanced, whether it's actually something that would be fairly easy to run, is not the main concern. Is it well written, right? One of the complaints I have about Blood Drive is it is so ridiculous with the number of really long, really large battles where you have, your 4 or 5 player characters, you have 20 NPCs allied with them who are, on the cattle drive, like the other ranch hands. And then you have, because there are so many of them, then most of the battles are, scaled to that, so you have 20 or 30 enemies attacking, along with 20 or 30 allies plus the player characters, and you're looking at a battle that's going to take you 4 hours to run. As efficient as Savage Worlds is, it's not efficient at running 40 on 40 battles, right? And I had to turn some of them into like dramatic tasks, because a dramatic task, it doesn't matter how many people there are, right? The players are just, and we're just, by the way, I'm just setting the limit, figuring out the limits of this zone so I can figure out where I have to look. Um, but in a dramatic task, the players just have 4 rounds. Each one takes a turn. The NPCs can't really do anything during a dramatic task. Although what I'll sometimes do is allow the NPCs to try and give them a penalty, right? I'll make all the NPCs together. We'll do like a group roll, and they're trying to penalize you, right? And you'll have to make a roll at -1 or -2 or whatever. So it was an unrunnable adventure. Like, it could not be run as written. It was ridiculous to run it as written, and I would bet no one has ever actually run it as written. And even probably the guy who wrote it, John Goff, I doubt he ran it as written with his players, if he ran it with his players, because you kind of can't, right? It's completely impractical. I think he probably did a bunch of cool random stuff that his players liked, and so he put that in, and figured my players would like it, and some of it they did, and some of it they probably wouldn't have, so I took it out. But we've not seen a single device here. Okay, they must be up north. Yeah, I would be shocked if he and his players did anything remotely like the way it was written, just because it's so impractical to run it. And so, but it reads really cool, right? When I read it, it sounded like a cool adventure. I read through it. I read it like a book. It read well. It was written fairly well. I wasn't at the time thinking about running it because we weren't even playing Deadlands. And then when my players decided they wanted to play it, I went in, I bought the module from Foundry, right? The Foundry module for it, because I had the hardcover book before that. And as I started trying to like take the maps and lay out the tokens on the maps to prepare for battles and stuff, I started to realize, holy crap, this is a huge battle. How the heck am I, as a fairly beginning Savage Worlds GM, supposed to run? One of the very first battles is enormous. And they don't even provide a map for it. Right? You have the 16 or so trail hands. 4 of them aren't there because 4 random ones are out watching the whole herd. But you have 16 or so ranch hands. You got 4 player characters, which is fairly average. It's a normal size posse, right? That's 20 guys on the side of the heroes of the posse. And then you've got I think it was like 12 zombies, 2 bat swarms, and like 8 snipers for Bayou Vermilion Rail, all involved and trying to attack the player characters and their allies. And so you have this just ridiculous, and I'm looking at this going, wait a minute, there's no map? Are you serious? Like, do they expect me to do theater of the mind with like a 20 on 30 battle? I mean, maybe some GMs would be good enough to do that, but I can't hold all that crap in my head. So I'm going to have a map, and I'm going to have to put the tokens out there. There's no map. So I had to make my own. Right? And even the maps that they do provide were kind of small, low resolution in Foundry, right? This is partly a Foundry issue with the module. But like, they provide these maps that are, again, like a half a page in size just to show the GM, but I'm going to have to buff all those maps up. I'm going to have to put more detail in these maps. Like, again, what am I paying for? I had to create the maps. I had to basically create the NPCs, a bunch of them, And what did you provide me exactly? The roll table for the NPCs? I could get that out of Ironsworn. Which by the way is a free PDF. If you don't want to buy like the hardcover book or something, you can get the free PDF on that'll give you the personality and the goals and everything of random generic characters. So I found it very frustrating to try and run that module. But Shepus's point is, yeah, you weren't supposed to run it. You were just supposed to read it and imagine running. I mean, that's what it was designed for. If you are able to run it, that's a bonus, but you're going to have to do a lot of work. So, to Derek and to the guys at Roll for Combat, and as you can see, I'm now regretting I auto-completed that other mission because this is going to be a pain. Like, I'm going to have to fight every single guy in here because I have no idea where Dr. Calvin is. Yeah, the reason people struggle and say they have to do more work than they would otherwise have had to do isn't that it's a railroad or not. It's that it's written and organized to be read, not played. And you write something very differently when you're organizing it to be read than when you're organizing it to not be read but played. Right? Matt Colville talks about this. He's always frustrated. Why do they wait until the end in the back of the module when you meet the villain, where the player characters meet the villain in the book, that location? He's like, turn to that first when you open a module, because for whatever reason, it's almost like he doesn't realize it either. They don't put the information on who the villain is in the module. And we're just going to fight everybody, right? Because eventually, by tab targeting somebody, I will get to the hostage takers, although I have no idea where the last device is. And I may have to abandon this mission. This is why I really, by the way, this is why I really don't like, we'll get back to Matt Colville, but this is why I really don't like doing Tina McIntyre's stuff. Because every single mission is an outdoor mission. They're all incredibly huge maps, and they're all needle in a haystack. Like, every single one of them is find this one thing, or these 3 or 4 things on this giant map. And these are probably the worst missions. This is the worst content in City of Heroes, in my opinion. Much more frustrating than fighting Nervous Spectral Demons is trying to find one hostage on this massive map, hidden somewhere under the corner of a building, and it's all a bunch of minions who have no chance of threatening me, even if they're purple. And I just have to go through and beat every single one of them up until I finally tab target to the one that's got the hostage. And yeah, I mean, I guess rather than 10 minutes ago just starting flying around here, I should have just done that to begin with. But I was trying to shortcut it because it's so ridiculously long and tedious. I would so much rather be on an indoor map. Because there are only so many places things can be on an indoor map. Sometimes they're hard to find anyway, but it's nowhere near as bad as this. Anyway, Matt Colville says, when you buy an adventure, right, flip to the back, find the place where the villain's lair is, and read that, because that will tell you who the villain is, what his motivations are, and what he's trying to do. Right? They don't tell you that in the beginning of the module. So ask yourself, why? Why don't they tell you it in the beginning of the module? Matt doesn't seem to know, but I know. Because it would be spoilers. Right? They act like they're trying not to spoil the ending of the story at the beginning. But I'm the GM. Right? I need to know the whole story. There is no spoilers for me. I need to know it all. Right? Players shouldn't be reading that stuff, but they shouldn't be buying these adventures. Right? So the reason that they do it this way, and they kind of, tell you about the character when you encounter it, and they don't give you like a table of characters that summarizes them and stuff, is because that would be spoilers, and we're catering to the reader, not the game master who's going to run it. And so the reason these things require so much work is that you have to basically take a written adventure that's written to be read. It's literally the equivalent, quite literally the equivalent of reading a novel and trying to turn that into the adventure, because that's what it is. Right? So there's a novel that very graphically and beautifully describes a 20 on 30 battle, and then what you have to do is take that 20 on 30 battle described in the novel and translate it into game terms. That's pretty much what most of these adventures are making you do, right? The railroading thing is an issue on top of that. Do I hear a glowy? I thought I was hearing a glowy, but I don't. The railroading thing is a separate issue on top of that. And that's a problem of the writers of the adventure making a lot of assumptions about what the player characters are going to do, many of them unjustified. But I have less of a problem with that, right? Because, for instance, he said, well, you can either have a railroad or one that takes a lot of work to do. Well, Blood Drive is a complete railroad. And I warn my players of this. You get on the drive, you cannot get off of it, you're going one particular direction. You must encounter every encounter there because it's the only way. You got to follow the trail or you can't get to Wyoming. Right? So it's a literal railroad. And it still took an insane amount of work for me to do. Right? Most of the set piece battles do not have maps. Or they have a map that cannot be used as a battle map. So I had to make battle maps for every single major set piece battle except the battle at Galt's Gulch, which I switched to a dramatic task because that was like a 50 on 50. There, Galt is this villain. He has like, I don't know, 40 minions and a couple lieutenants and stuff. He's like 45 people working for him. And then the players, as part of the story, they're able to recruit townsfolk and rail workers to fight against Galt. So they get 10 townsfolk, up to 10 townsfolk, 10 rail workers, half of their NPCs, right? So that's like 25 or 30 of them. And then Galt has 45, and then some of the other NPCs are captive. You can free them. And then, by the way, the cattle are all there. There's 1,000 or so of them. And you could cause a stampede of the cattle, and then that's going to cause another whole thing to trigger another whole thing. So it's like you could be running a battle and a stampede at the same time with 1,000 cattle and like 75 NPCs and 4 or 5 player characters. That they gave you an okay battle map for. But they also had a bunch of devil bats, like 20 devil bats come in and attack the posse and the cows and everything. And they just described you're in a river, like in a ravine. There was no map for it. I had to make my own map. I had to find a river map or make my own because they didn't provide a map. There's, again, the battle like early on at the beginning where they're fighting the Bio-Vermilion guys and some zombies and stuff. There's no map. There's a huge battle where they fight a bunch of rail workers on their side, plus the 15 or so ranch hands fight against a bunch of X Squad members from Wasatch Rail, like 10 or 12 of them, and a guy in an iron wagon, like a steam wagon, plus a couple of NPCs manning the guns and the steering wheel of that wagon, plus in the second or third round, a metal automaton shows up that's like super powerful, and they have to fight that too. No map. They give you the stats, which are basically the stats straight out of the Deadlands core book. They give you the stats of the villains, and they go ahead and run the battle. There's no hints to the GM. How do you run a big battle like this in any of those battles? It's just, oh, we'll let the player characters each control, several of the railhand NPCs. Well, it's still a long battle, right? I complained about this, and somebody was like, oh, it's no problem. It's easy. Like, no. My player is controlling themselves and 4 ranch hands. That's 5 characters in this battle, okay? Even if you can resolve each character's turn in just about 2 minutes, each player takes 10 minutes to go for their turn on the round. If you have 4 players, it takes 40 minutes to get through their rounds, and then it's going to take me as a GM 10 minutes to do the villain NPCs. It takes nearly an hour to get through a round. an hour to get through one round, which means if you're playing, you play 10 minutes a round and you watch 50 minutes. That's super boring. And this is over and over again, right? There are like 8 of these kinds of encounters in Blood Drive. And okay, where is the... You want to be a useful module? Write up a section on how do you do this quickly and efficiently so it doesn't take you 5 hours to run an encounter. Right? They don't explain any of that. You're left on your own. It's here's this ridiculous number of NPCs. 10 of these stat blocks, 20 of these stat blocks, 14 of these stat blocks, plus the player characters, and there's a battle in the desert. No desert map. No advice on how to run the battle. No advice on how to make it work quickly and efficiently. Just run it. That's what we mean by it's more work, right? I mean, the battle setup is all the work they did. And what you have is like 3 pages of this guy and the ridiculous encounter you have with him, where it is super railroady, right? All the detail they give me, the railroady part, I had to delete it because it didn't fit for what we were doing, right? They assumed that the player characters were going to have the plans of this automaton, right? Which they did. But they assumed that the player characters weren't going to want to give them up. And they're like, well, if they don't want to give them up, he's going to start a fight. If they do want to give them up, he will say these are fake because they aren't real. They are false plans. They're something that Wasatch Rail planted to fool the U.S. cavalry. And it was stolen from the U.S. cavalry. It ends up in the player character's hands. And so when he shows you the plan, when you show him the plans, he doesn't believe you. He thinks you're trying to trick him, and you have the real plans. So no matter what the players do, they're going to get into combat with this guy. But they also have it set up that he comes back like 3 or 4 times before he finally gets into combat with them, right? A couple of times. And so, and there's nothing else in there. Like he'll leave. But what if the players stop him from leaving? No comment. Doesn't say in the book. What if the players try to stop him from leaving? Doesn't say, right? He'll leave and then he will come back tomorrow, and he'll make this demand. And assuming the players don't give it to him or they give him the thing and he doesn't believe them, he's going to attack them. Right? And so, and it's got all his motivations written in text, most of which are irrelevant because he's probably going to die. Right? And it's got like all this flowery description of stuff, but no explanation of how to run the encounter properly, right? How to do it so that it doesn't like blow up in your face and take forever. And no allowance made with all the text. No allowance made for the fact that the players might not have the plans or might not even know what plans he's talking about because it's a railroad, right? So you've got 3 pages or something of descriptive text that's very like novel-like short story narrative. Very, very well written, but useless. That is the railroad that's utterly useless. And then the part that's not the railroad that's potentially useful, which is how to set up the battle and run it, is very Spartan and not enough information is given. And this is, I'm not just picking on Blood Drive. This is like all adventures are like this from every company. They're all like this. And so to Derek and the guys that Roll for Combat, this isn't about railroading. This is about having an adventure that is organized in a way that is not useful to the GM. And the reason I have to do a bunch of work is because they didn't give me what I needed. They gave me pages of what I don't need and none of what I needed. Okay? That's the problem. Champions used to be the same way, right? The Champions Adventures, you really need battle maps in Champions because of the way it's very important to have hex-based combat. You've got to have it. You need to have good maps that have not just the walls, but all kinds of detail so that because player characters, much more so in Champions than in most other games, do a lot of interacting with the environment. They can pick up and throw things. They can be smashed into things. Villains can pick up and like smash you with a table. If you read the example from the old Champions second edition rulebook, where Ogre is in a bank, right? Ogre picks up a table and smashes somebody with it. Somebody else gets knocked through the teller window, right? It's very kinetic, very dynamic type of combat. You've got to have all these details, right? And you need a big map to run it on. And the Champions Adventures don't give you any of that. They give you all this narrative, all the railroad, yeah, but they don't give you the maps to use with the railroad. So I had to draw the maps. I had to draw the artwork for a lot of the villains. Only like a couple of the main characters were shown. I had to do a lot of it, right? They provided the villains, and the Champions guys, bizarrely enough, are some of the worst stat block makers, if you want to call it that, I've ever seen. Like, it's like they don't even know their own game. They would create what are supposed to be really powerful villains that my player characters would have just mowed down because the villains didn't have any defenses. Right? You'd have a villain with no resistant defenses at all. Huge PDED, no resistant defense. Like, are you kidding me? A 2-6 RKA is going to take this guy out. He'll be on the ground dying. 3-6 RKA with a good stun multiplier will one-shot him. Knocked unconscious, stunned and unconscious, out of the battle. So, I used to have to rewrite every single villain because they were badly designed. I used to have to draw by hand every map because they either didn't provide one or they provided one with no detail and it was really tiny. And I had to draw it big enough for us to use as a battle map. I had to rewrite the agents. And I had to rewrite the plots because they were terrible. Right? That's what we mean by I've got to do more work than if I just made it up by myself. Right? My best friend, when he did Candlekeep, right, after it was over, he said to me, I never should have done Candlekeep. He said, I thought it was going to save me work. But he said, I ended up having to basically undo, like, it gave him some maps. And some of them weren't good enough, and he had to do the same thing. He had to go online and find other maps because he didn't like the maps that they gave him, or they weren't detailed, or they weren't big enough, or whatever. And at the time, you couldn't get your maps from, it wasn't easy to get your maps from D&D Beyond into Foundry, so he had to find his own maps. Now that's a virtual tabletop problem, but like he didn't like the plots, so he had to rewrite the plots. He didn't like the NPCs, so he had to make up new NPCs, right? He could use some of the seeds of the ideas and a couple of the maps and setting places. Right, he was able to use Candlekeep itself as a base town and the NPCs in there, and that's okay. But most of the rest of it, he had to do the adventures, like, he had to make his own stuff up. So, like, why did I pay for this 17 adventure book and I can't even use the adventures as written because they're so bad? That's why people are complaining. It's not because it's a railroad, it's because it's a bad railroad. It's not because it's a railroady encounter, it's because it's a bad encounter, it's incomplete. I have to do just as much work. And the problem becomes, if it's my idea, at least I know what I want and I can go do it, right? Versus if it's their idea, I've got to figure out how to make their stupid thing work, which is a lot of times more work than just making up my own stupid thing. If you think about like making your own adventures in D&D or something, one of the things you could literally do is go online to find a free battle map, find a couple of free battle maps that are made by the same map maker and maybe kind of a related environment, and looking at the maps, use the maps to get inspiration for an adventure, right? Now you don't have to go find an appropriate battle map because you've got one, right? You started with that. But if you're like playing Deadlands and there's a saloon and you got to have a battle in the saloon and you want to have a map, you got to go find a saloon map. There aren't a lot of those. Or you got to make one up. Well, good luck finding the assets for that. Or you got to hand draw it. Well, that would be more work than if I made up my own encounter and didn't put it in a saloon, right? And put it somewhere where I already had a map to. And so this is what we mean by it's more work, right? Think about the electronic resources, Foundry, right? I love the guys at Pinnacle, but the people who make the Foundry conversions of their modules are extremely sloppy. Every single minion, every extra, extras don't get bennies, every single extra, every one in the Hard Headstone Hill, every single one, and there are like 80 of them, every single one of the named NPCs, I have had to go in and edit because all of them say they have 2 of 0 bennies. No, they have no bennies. I can't have them having bennies in the battle, right? Because then the interface will offer to let me use bennies, and when I go to use benny, instead of using a GM benny, it'll use their benny. That they're not supposed to have 2 of 0. Every single one of them, whether they're hostile or not, is set to hostile on the token sheet. Every single one of them, if they have a name, like their character name on the character sheet, but if you look at the token that is on the map, and you click on that, and you hover over the name, it's the name of the generic token. So, for example, if they say, you know, Jenny Pistol is on the Gunman Veteran stat block, you'll open up the Jenny Pistol character. You click on her token. It says Jenny Pistol on the character sheet, but when you click on the token and you open it up, the token name is Gunman Veteran. So that's what's going to appear on the map to the player characters, Gunman Veteran. That's what's going to appear in the encounter tracker, Gunman Veteran. So you get 3 or 4 of these characters that are all named in the book but are based on the tweak of the Gunman Veteran stat block. Nobody's going to know who they are. Oh, they use the generic Gunman Veteran picture. Even though Jenny Pistol isn't a man, she's a woman, right? And so now I've got to go in. I've got to change the name of the token to the correct name because they didn't do it. I've got to go in and I've got to mark the token as non-hostile if it's not a hostile token. I've got to check the box that says the token has token vision so that I can click on the token as a GM and see what their line of sight is. Can they even see this NPC character and to shoot him, right? Or the player character to shoot him? None of them have line of sight, so I have to give them a line of sight. None of them have... none of them are linked, right? Linked actor data, which means that it persists across instances of the token, whether they have wounds or fatigue or something like that, which may or may not matter for NPCs, but for a named NPC, you're supposed to link the tokens, and it's incorrect not to. So I have to go into every single one of the villains. I've had to go in and edit. This doesn't have anything to do with railroading, and it's not really part of the written adventure, right? It's a problem with the module, but this is an example, an electronic example of why we say this would be more work than if I just copied it and pasted the Gunman Veteran and did the edits myself, because I have to make just as many edits as I would have, if not more, because the Gunman Veteran doesn't have 2 of 0 Benny. So I think one of the problems is they're taking a stat block that's a wild card, like the Gunman, his default wild card, the Veteran Gunman, and they're turning it into an extra instead of a wild card, which gives it no bennies, but they forgot to delete the 2 bennies in the benny list. Sloppy, right? And there's a lot of this in written adventures. Again, it's not just Pinnacle. I'm not picking on them. A lot of published adventures are sloppy like this. And I have to go in as the GM and correct the sloppiness. And are you guys seeing this? I don't see where this kidnapped victim is. Right? So the reason, and we're about to level up now, the reason that people complain isn't that it's a railroad, it's that it's a sloppy, incomplete railroad that we have to go in and fix because the designers didn't do it right. And if I have to go in and fix it, and it takes me hours and hours to rip their mistakes out of there and put what's supposed to be in there, all right, let's go back to Hard Headstone Hill with all the NPCs. Because Pinnacle didn't bother to provide me with an NPC lookup table or something, I have had to make my own spreadsheet with, why do I know there are over 200 named NPCs in the module? Because I have them, and that's how many rows there are on my spreadsheet. And I'm not even done with all of Uinta County. All I did was 3 or 4 of the towns that they would come to before coming to Headstone Hill, and then Headstone Hill itself. I still got like 8 more towns to go. And I haven't even looked up the characters that aren't in the towns but are in the Savage Tales or one of the other sections of the book. There are like 300 named NPCs. You don't create a lookup table for that. You don't create an index for that. I mean, there's an index in the book with names as well as everything else, but there's no list of NPCs and where to find them, right? There should be an alphabetical list of NPCs and a lookup table of where do we find these NPCs, right? Because it's in building 62 or it's in building 41. I have that in my spreadsheet, right? It's got the name, and the very next column is where you find them, where they're located. And if they could be in more than one location, then I have a notes section that says they might also be in this location, or this location. Are you kidding me with this? Why can't I get in here? So yeah, the reason that these adventures are bad and unusable is that they're made to be written and not played. And therefore, they can't be played as written because they weren't made to be. And that's the problem, and that's why people complain. Because the people who were trying to run them didn't buy them to read them. They bought them to run them. And they weren't designed for that purpose. They were simply designed to be read. And with that, I think we're going to leave this mission, and I will abandon it at my earliest opportunity because I don't know where Dr. Calvin is. I'm tabbing like crazy, and I can't find anybody else to fight. And I think whoever wrote this adventure should never be allowed to write any missions for any game anywhere ever again. This is horrible. I've been everywhere. You can see that on the map, right? It's all cleared up now, right? Except for the parts of the buildings you can't go through. And I don't know where this enemy is, but we got a good rant in, and I'll see you guys next time. Until then, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes.